Get your junk truck off the track." The aristocrats sneered, swirling their champagne. The mud-soaked, dirt-poor driver tuned them out, calmly snapping his goggles tight. In the dead of night, deep in the mud, their flashy supercars were breaking down one by one. The madman slammed the gas pedal to the floorboard, waking up the aluminum pistons he had hammered out by hand in a hellish furnace. Zero trash talk, just a massive fireball violently spitting from the exhaust. This heavy-duty truck bullied its way past them in a brutal overtake, swallowing their arrogance whole. Under the spotlight, a pair of black hands, permanently embedded with grease and calluses, pushed open the car door, crushing every ounce of high society pride and personally crowning the ultimate luxury of the automotive world. Number 78 Avenue Road in London's Hampstead district, 1905, was a massive 14-room Victorian mansion. It belonged to Alfred Bentley, a tycoon who had amassed a staggering fortune in Australian mining and banking. Beneath the lavish dome of this estate, heavy Persian rugs covered the floors, and intricate silver cutlery lined the long dining tables. The London financial barons and hereditary aristocrats, wearing silk top hats and clutching gold-tipped canes, sipped Royal Ceylon tea and debated Cambridge rowing and thoroughbred horse breeding. In their eyes, the world ran on parchment contracts, stock tickers, and high art. Getting your hands dirty with soil or machinery was strictly peasant work. As the youngest son of the Bentley Empire, 16-year-old Walter Owen Bentley sat quietly on a velvet sofa, listening to the elders map out his prestigious life. According to these arrogant blue bloods, all he had to do was grab a diploma from Clifton College, and he could spend the rest of his days barking orders from an oak-paneled office, coasting on pure privilege. But on that late autumn afternoon, W.O. Bentley made a move that left the entire mansion dead silent. He tossed a signed contract right next to the silver platters. It was an apprenticeship indenture for the Great Northern Railway's Doncaster Locomotive Works. To get this ticket to a blue-collar hell, he forced his father to shell out a massive premium of £75. Back in the early 1900s, that kind of cash could cover a working-class family's living expenses for a decade. Yet, it was being dumped as a reverse sponsorship, just to let a filthy rich kid scrub the floors as a bottom-tier heavy industry apprentice. The elders erupted in condescending laughter. They figured this was just a rich boy's 3-day slumming phase, betting he would come crying back to the warm baths of Avenue Road the second he smelled an open sewer. Facing their arrogant mockery, Bentley did not argue. He simply stripped off his custom velvet coat with the family crest, untied his silk cravat, and threw on a set of rough overalls that reeked of cheap cotton and raw machine oil. Grabbing a beat-up tin lunchbox, the Avenue Road golden boy killed off his old identity and walked straight into the shadows of Doncaster's towering black smokestacks without looking back. In the ultimate mocking contrast to that £75 premium, his rock-bottom salary was a measly 25 pence a week. The Doncaster plant was no rich kid's playground. It was a heavy industry monster that ate solid steel and puked black smoke. Every morning at 6 o'clock, piercing steam whistles ripped through the biting northern England wind, and Walter had to be standing right in front of the glowing red steel furnaces of the foundry. The foreman and veteran hardhats, waiting to see the joke, threw the most dangerous, back-breaking, iron-smashing jobs at this pale, rich kid, fully expecting him to break down and beg for mercy. They calculated wrong. Multi-ton pneumatic hammers smashed into red-hot steel ingots with the force of a thunderbolt, sending molten iron flying like deadly buckshot. When it hit the skin, it left a charred, bone-deep brand. Walter's hands, which were supposed to be turning the pages of Latin poetry, locked in a death grip around heavy cast-iron sledgehammers. swinging relentlessly into solid metal components. The massive recoil tore through the webbing of his thumbs. Flesh peeled back, and blood mixed with rust and coal dust, eventually hardening into thick layers of calluses. He dragged himself through puddles of machine oil, iron shavings, and stinging sulfur gas. Sweat washed muddy trenches down his soot-blackened face. For 3.5 straight years, he never took a single sick day. He never complained. He used his own flesh and blood to absorb their malicious hazing, literally forging himself into a human iron gear. But that was just the warm-up. In 1909, Walter climbed onto the footplate of the 442 Atlantic Express locomotive designed by Chief Mechanical Engineer Henry Ivat, officially becoming a steam locomotive fireman. When the train was tearing across the countryside at 80 miles per hour, the boiler room turned into an iron cage sealed shut by hundreds of degrees of heat. The scream of high-pressure steam ripping through valves, combined with the roar of dozens of tons of steel wheels grinding on iron rails, completely blowing past the limits of human hearing. The Atlantic's firebox was a bottomless, devouring mouth, burning with a fire hot enough to melt damn near anything. Every few minutes, fighting the violently shaking footplate, Walter had to yank open the massive cast-iron fire door. A literal wall of heat, blinding white light, and flying sparks would punch him right in the face. He locked his hands around the scalding handle of the shovel, scooped up dozens of pounds of black anthracite coal, executed a violently precise pivot in the cramped space, and pitched the coal perfectly deep into the firebox. Sweat didn't drip. It poured like a waterfall, instantly vaporizing into a sticky salt crust on his skin. Lethal sulfur dioxide and coal cinder glued themselves to his nostrils and eyelashes. His lungs felt like they were stuffed with burning sandpaper. The muscles in his arms twitched and spasmed from the extreme overload, and his blonde hair baked into a crispy, foul-smelling mess. Through this inhuman torture, what Walter saw wasn't suffering, but the absolute power of humanity conquering nature through extreme mechanical design. He used his own body as a sensor to feel the vibration of every connecting rod and the temper of every metal under maximum stress. 5 years in hellish purgatory burned away every ounce of upper-class softness and vanity, injecting his bone marrow with a fanatic religion of indestructible mechanical engineering. Deep down, that soot-faced, shovel-wielding boilerman was laying the most hardcore groundwork for an automotive empire that would soon turn the world upside down. Late autumn, 1913, Surrey. Freezing winds cut like razor blades across the gravel test track at Brooklands. By now, W.O. Bentley and his brother had set up shop in London, selling the 12 to 15 horsepower touring cars made by the French company DFP. As a former Isle of Man motorcycle racer, he couldn't stand how painfully slow this car was. During a trip to the French factory, an aluminum paperweight sitting on a desk sparked an explosive idea. He proposed using low melting point aluminum to cast internal combustion engine pistons. The entire British engineering establishment and the classically trained French engineers laughed him out of the room. Those traditional experts, sitting in their well-lit offices holding thick thermodynamics textbooks, smugly declared that putting aluminum inside a combustion chamber hitting thousands of degrees was like throwing butter into a blast furnace. It would melt into worthless scrap instantly. They looked at Bentley, a guy reeking of motor oil with no proper college degree, like he was a delusional madman, just waiting for him to kill himself on the track. Bentley didn't waste a single breath arguing with these arrogant giants. He grabbed his chief mechanic and disappeared into an underground workshop that looked like a medieval alchemy lab, kicking off a grueling marathon of metallurgy experiments. After thousands of ruined crucibles, they finally cracked the outlaw formula. 88% pure aluminum mixed with 12% copper. With no automated machines, he cast every single piston by hand in sand molds, grinding them down millimeter by millimeter on a vintage lathe amidst deafening screeches. These handmade pistons weighed 50% less than the factory cast iron ones. Now, these 4 aluminum pistons, carrying his entire faith and life savings, were strapped into a stripped-down test car beneath his feet. No roof, no doors, not even a windshield. Bentley was flying down the unpaved dirt track at nearly 80 miles per hour. The front wheels shredded the sharp gravel, spitting rocks like machine gun fire point blank into the driver's seat. A sharp rock the size of a thumb smashed into his heavy leather goggles. With a sickening crack, the expensive glass shattered into a spider web. Another stone grazed his right cheek, tearing a 2-inch gash in his flesh. Warm blood poured out, instantly drying in the wind into a dark red scab, mixing with coal dust, oil, and dirt to form a terrifying war mask. In a split second that would make any sane driver slam the brakes, Bentley's heavy leather boot stayed bolted to the floorboard. He kept the metal gas pedal pinned to the wood without backing off a single millimeter. He wasn't out here to race. He was putting the engine through a brutal, life-or-death mechanical interrogation. The 4-cylinder engine was screaming past 3,000 revolutions per minute in a violently reciprocating frenzy. Every ignition explosion was a ruthless test of the aluminum's thermal limits. If even one piston expanded and seized or shattered under the strain, the engine would detonate in a tenth of a second, sending red-hot shrapnel and boiling oil to tear him to shreds. Massive potholes tossed the chassis like a raft in a hurricane. The skinny tires frantically searched for grip on the loose dirt. The steering wheel fought back with a terrifying force, threatening to snap his wrists. Bentley's forearms bulged with veins as he used pure physical muscle to suppress a machine constantly threatening to tear itself apart. Through the chaotic roar of wind and metal, he zeroed in on the engine's acoustics. No knocking, no scraping. Just the silky, flawless rhythm of aluminum pistons pumping inside the cylinder walls. Less than 200 yards ahead, a vicious 90-degree blind corner loomed like a wall of death. The mechanical brakes of the era were absolute garbage. Hitting them hard on loose gravel meant an instant lockup and a fatal rollover. But the signal to slow down never even crossed Bentley's brain. The ultimate point of this suicide run was to see if these new pistons would melt or seize when hit with massive lateral forces and a sudden loss of oil lubrication. Facing a storm of flying rocks, he violently whipped the steering wheel to the right, his foot still mercilessly crushing the gas pedal to the floor. The chassis groaned with a sickening twist of metal, the left wheels lifting slightly off the ground from the extreme centrifugal force. An avalanche of dirt and rocks sprayed from the rear tires. Right at the bleeding edge of losing control and wrapping the car around an oak tree, Bentley relied on his hardcore Isle of Man racing instincts to countersteer and save it. This violently aggressive drift put an unimaginable torque load on the engine, throwing all the oil to one side of the pan and starving the pump. That fraction of a second of absolute dry friction would have melted and destroyed any traditional cast iron piston instantly. But a miracle happened. The 4 aluminum pistons, with their superior heat dissipation and feather-light mass, easily survived the lethal dry spell. As the tires hooked up on the exit, the engine RPMs violently spiked. The exhaust let out an ear-shattering boom, spitting a foot-long blue flame. The machine clawed its way out of the corner, roaring onto the straightaway like a rabid cheetah. Bentley's face was caked in mud and blood. His hands were trembling from muscle spasms, and his eardrums were practically blown. Yet, through cracked and bleeding lips, he cracked a faint smile in the hurricane winds. He won. The four little components dancing inside the engine block beneath his feet had just become a cold-blooded death warrant for the arrogance of textbook engineers. He broke through the 90-mile-per-hour barrier. The aerodynamic drag felt like a concrete wall trying to push him backward. He tucked his body down, folding himself awkwardly over the freezing steering wheel. The chassis rivets were being tortured, but the aluminum-equipped engine was singing a flawlessly smooth tune at maximum limit. Endless, brutal horsepower dumped to the rear wheels. The deafening hail of rocks hitting the undercarriage was the heavy metal symphony of a new era. This former bottom-tier apprentice, who used his own flesh to kick down the doors of hardcore speed, kept his foot pinned to the scalding throttle, charging head first toward the ultimate slaughterhouse of Le Mans. Fast forward to the 1920s at the Circuit de la Sarthe in Le Mans, France. It was a mechanical gladiator arena paved with gravel, dirt, melting tar, and unburned fuel. In an era when racing still held the brutal vibe of a medieval duel, the hierarchy of disrespect was crystal clear. Ettore Bugatti stood by the weigh-in area, watching those massive steel monsters painted in British racing green slowly roll onto the grid. A fiercely arrogant smirk hung on Bugatti's face as he famously trash-talked to the reporters, declaring that Mr. W.O. Bentley didn't build race cars. He built the fastest heavy trucks in the world. Bugatti had the right to be cocky. His Bugatti Type 35 weighed less than 1,700 pounds, packed a precision-built 2.0-liter straight-8 engine, and featured body lines as smooth as a drop of water. It was the absolute pinnacle of Latin lightweight design and aerodynamics. The Bentley 4.5-liter parked across from it, however, was a 2-ton rolling iron foundry. W.O. Bentley's philosophy was rooted in a stubborn, heavy metal brutality. This so-called truck sat on a massive ladder-frame steel chassis, suspended by stiff semi-elliptic leaf springs. Under the hood lay a massive long-stroke inline-4 engine. Its cast-iron block was ridiculously thick, featuring an overhead camshaft and 4 valves per cylinder, driven by a giant vertical bevel gear shaft. It didn't scream at high RPMs. Instead, at just 3,000 RPM, it churned out enough terrifying torque to pull a freight train. Down the right side of the body ran a hilariously thick, completely exposed exhaust pipe. No mufflers, no heat shields. It looked like an artillery cannon strapped to the side of the car. The brakes were violently primitive, 4 massive mechanical drums that required the leg strength of an Olympic weightlifter to engage. The unsynchronized gearbox featured a shift lever mounted completely outside the car, forcing the driver to lean halfway out of the cockpit into the howling wind just to change gears. When night fell on the 1928 24 Hours of Le Mans, the track turned into a black hole that swallowed all sanity. A sudden mid-June downpour turned the unpaved roads into a muddy swamp. This was a death match with zero modern lighting. On the Mulsanne Strait at 11 at night, the 4-mile stretch was drowning in darkness, with only the quartz headlights barely cutting through the rain. In that suffocating pitch black, Sir Tim Birkin was piloting this mud-caked heavy truck out on a savage hunt. Birkin had been behind the wheel for over 4 straight hours. He didn't have a modern full-face helmet, just a canvas flying cap and goggles completely smeared with mud. To see the road, he had to stick his head outside the tiny aero screen, letting the 100-mile-per-hour rain, gravel, and mud shot from the cars ahead blast his face like a shotgun. Freezing rain soaked through his leather jacket, but the cockpit was a blazing inferno. The massive engine baked the firewall to temperatures high enough to strike a match. The air choked him with the stench of raw, high-octane gas, burnt castor oil, and asbestos brake dust. Every pothole sent massive shock waves straight up his spine. This wasn't driving. It was hand-to-hand combat to pin down a rabid, prehistoric beast. Approaching the pitch-black Arnage corner, the lightweight Bugatti danced through the mud ahead like a ghost. Its cornering was graceful, the nimble chassis holding the perfect racing line through the sludge. But the heavy metal crackdown was about to arrive without warning. Birkin caught the faint red taillight in his peripheral vision. He didn't even think about lifting off the throttle. Trusting his heavy machinery with his life, he pushed his braking point to a borderline suicidal limit. At the absolute last second, he initiated a dizzying sequence of mechanical domination. His right foot slammed onto the impossibly heavy brake pedal, his muscles fighting the physics of 2 tons of momentum trying to launch him forward. The giant brake drums shrieked, tires clawing at the mud. The external gearbox had no synchros. Miss the rev match, and the transmission would shatter instantly. Birkin kicked the clutch with his left foot, grabbed the outside shifter with his right hand, and violently yanked it into neutral. Then, with his right heel still pinning the brake, he pivoted his toes sharply to the right and stomped the gas pedal. The massive engine roared like a monster. The needle jumped. He clutched in again and slammed the lever into a lower gear. In that fraction of a second, an epic physical reaction occurred. The aggressive downshift pushed unburned, ultra-rich fuel straight out the exhaust valves into the blistering hot side pipe. When that fuel hit the glowing red metal, it detonated. It sounded like a heavy artillery shell firing in the dead of night. A 2-foot-long, blinding, white-hot fireball violently blasted out of the Bentley's exhaust pipe, followed by a deafening sonic boom. The wild flames ripped through the dark Le Mans night, illuminating the French poplar trees and lighting up the Bugatti driver's face in the rearview mirror. The Bugatti driver's arrogant smirk instantly twisted into absolute panic. The earth-shaking roar of the exhaust completely drowned out the torrential rain, striking the muddy track like a sledgehammer. Against this fire-breathing leviathan, Bugatti's lightweight advantage meant absolutely nothing. Birkin didn't care about the perfect racing line. He weaponized the Bentley's brute force low-end torque, violently forcing the heavy front end into the inside of the corner. The massive, thick-treaded tires violently dug into inches of mud and gravel. The 2-ton curb weight became his deadliest weapon, throwing water and mud backward like heavy machine gun fire, showering the Bugatti's fragile, delicate aluminum body with a terrifying barrage of dents and cracks. The Bentley fishtailed wildly in the sludge, the rear end kicking out. Birkin locked his arms onto the heavy steering wheel, fighting the massive kickback to point the nose straight. As he exited the turn, he pinned the throttle to the floor. The giant engine let out a suffocating roar, translating torque into relentless thrust, literally ripping the muddy steel beast out of the swamp. Spitting fire and screaming with dominance, the Bentley violently overpowered the Bugatti, leaving the lightweight masterpiece that once called it a truck completely in the dust of the dark, rainy night. With primitive, brutal steel willpower, it hammered out a heavy industry myth at Le Mans that sent shivers down the spine of the entire world. When you trace this heavy metal hurricane back to its soul, the timeline freezes in early November 1919 at the Olympia Motor Show in London. Booth 126 was packed with crowds, the air thick with the smell of premium cigars and sherry. Blinding spotlights poured down from the dome, shining perfectly on a bare Bentley 3-liter chassis that had been brought to the show without a body. At the top of the massive radiator grille, the Flying Bee mascot, designed by F. Gordon Crosby after months of painstaking work, gleamed with brilliant brass glory. Right in front of this emblem, which was about to become the ultimate symbol of British luxury and speed, a pair of hands slowly reached out. Hands that looked completely out of place among the silk tuxedos and high society. They were the hands of W.O. Bentley. They weren't wrapped in fine lambskin gloves. The knuckles were enlarged and slightly deformed from years of grueling manual labor. The backs of his hands were covered in dark red, decades-old burn scars. Deep inside the nail beds was a thick layer of pitch-black, heavy industrial machine grease that absolutely refused to wash out, no matter how hard he scrubbed with turpentine. Yet right now, these rough, dark hands that looked like they belonged to an East London dockworker or a Yorkshire coal stoker, were gently tracing the cold metal wings of the hood ornament millimeter by millimeter, with the breathtaking tenderness of a father holding a newborn. Every raised scar and stubborn grease stain was an exact physical record of this top-tier London rich kid's 14-year hardcore descent into heavy industry. That jagged, diamond-shaped burn on his right hand came from the dead of winter in 1906 at the Doncaster plant, when 2,700-degree molten iron vaporized his skin. The black powder fused into his bloodstream under his nails came from 1913, when razor-sharp metal shavings pierced his fingertips as he machined the world's first aero-grade aluminum pistons in a dingy basement. The 3-millimeter thick dead skin on his palms, hard as rhino hide, was the brutal price he paid during the First World War at the Coventry military plant, where he plunged his hands into 400-degree boiling castor oil waste every single day to save the lives of Royal Naval Air Service pilots. The thick, dark red scabs on his thumbs were from 1919 in a leaky, freezing stable on New Street, where he gripped an ice-cold scraper to manually shave copper-lead bearings thousands of times. On that foggy October night in 1919, when the first 3-liter engine roared to life with an earth-shattering boom, it was these same calloused black hands that held the violently vibrating throttle linkage wide open, taking hits from boiling oil and toxic fumes without flinching. Those wealthy buyers in their bespoke suits, holding French champagne and pointing at the chassis, would never truly understand the suffocating, hardcore mechanical tension radiating from that bare frame. All they saw was the vanity and luxury that money could buy. But under the spotlights, those black hands of a bottom-tier mechanic, stained with 14 years of grease and scarred by extreme heat, were the sacred sacrifice that gave this cold steel its soul. W.O. Bentley threw away the golden key to his family's vault, choosing instead to dive into the muck of heavy industry and fight steel with steel. Using every bone-deep scar on his hands to caress the most luxurious hood ornament in the world, he completely shattered the stigma that rich kids only played at making cars.